The story of Henry VIII begins not with his birthright as king, but with the unexpected circumstances that thrust him onto the English throne. Born on June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, Henry Tudor was the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. As a younger son, his early life was not shaped with kingship in mind. Instead, he was destined for the church or a noble role, while his older brother Arthur, Prince of Wales, was groomed as heir to the Tudor dynasty. Henry's childhood was spent in relative comfort and splendor, though under the strict supervision typical of royal upbringing in the late 15th century. He was provided with an exceptional education, steeped in humanist ideals, classical languages, theology, and the chivalric code. Tutors like John Skelton and Thomas More influenced his intellectual development, preparing him for a life of service to the crown, but not necessarily as the crown's wearer. Nevertheless, these formative years instilled in Henry a sense of grandeur, destiny, and personal capability that would shape his rule. The death of Prince Arthur in 1502, at the age of 15, dramatically altered the trajectory of young Henry's life. Suddenly, the second son became the primary focus of Tudor succession. The death of Arthur also had significant dynastic consequences, particularly because he had only recently married Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Catholic monarchs of Spain. The alliance forged through that marriage was at risk, and Henry VII was keen to preserve it by marrying Catherine to his surviving son. This proposed union would define much of Henry VIII's early political life. A papal dispensation was sought to allow Henry to marry his brother's widow, something canon law forbade. After much deliberation and political maneuvering, the papacy granted the dispensation, citing that Catherine's marriage to Arthur had not been consummated. This papal decree would later become the source of immense controversy during Henry's attempts to annul the marriage decades later. Henry ascended the throne in April 1509, following the death of his father. At just 17 years old, he was crowned king in a ceremony that symbolized the unity of the houses of Lancaster and York, a delicate legacy his father had worked hard to establish after the Wars of the Roses. Young and charismatic, Henry VIII was well received by the English people, who saw in him the promise of a golden age. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by an optimism that reflected both his personality and the mood of the nation. Tall, athletic, and charming, the young king stood in stark contrast to his father, whose rule had been characterized by cautious financial control and a tight grip on power. Henry VIII appeared to embrace a more open and lavish style of kingship, surrounding himself with artists, scholars, and courtiers. Henry quickly moved to distinguish himself from his father's legacy. He reversed many of his father's policies, executing some of the former king's unpopular ministers, such as Empson and Dudley. These acts, while politically motivated, also served as a theatrical statement of a new era. Henry sought to be seen as a benevolent ruler, in tune with the desires of his subjects. Yet he also revealed early signs of a ruthlessness that would grow more apparent in time. Another significant early decision was his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which took place just 2 months after his coronation. This union was not only a matter of statecraft. It solidified an important alliance with Spain, but also reportedly began with genuine affection between the young king and his bride. Their early marriage would be one of relative harmony, though would later become the source of the kingdom's most destabilizing crisis. In terms of governance, Henry initially left many affairs of state in the hands of trusted counselors, particularly Richard Fox and Thomas Wolsey. His interests leaned more toward pageantry, sport, and the trappings of monarchy than the mundane duties of governance. Yet even then, his intelligence and awareness of power dynamics were evident. He understood the importance of image and controlled courtly culture as a means to reinforce his authority and maintain loyalty. To understand Henry VIII, not just as a ruler, but as a man of his time, one must first consider the profound influence of Renaissance humanism on his early worldview. The Renaissance, spreading from Italy through the courts of Europe, reached England in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, bringing with it a revival of classical learning, art, and a new emphasis on the capabilities and dignity of man. Henry, unusually well educated for a monarch, absorbed these ideas with enthusiasm. He wasn't simply a king who ruled by divine right. He was a man who saw himself as a cultured, enlightened prince, an image he would promote actively and fervently. Henry's education was both rigorous and expansive. He was fluent in Latin and French, and had some command of Italian and Spanish. His tutors introduced him to the works of Cicero, Virgil, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas, while humanist thinkers like Desiderius Erasmus found favor in his court. Unlike many rulers of the time who delegated intellectual matters, Henry took personal pride in his learning and often engaged in scholarly debates. He wrote treatises on theology and music, composed poems, and even participated in theological arguments that would later shape England's religious future. Court life under young Henry was a vibrant, cosmopolitan affair. His court became a center of artistic and intellectual life in England, rivaling that of any European monarch. Musicians, poets, scholars, and painters were welcomed and encouraged. Hans Holbein the Younger, the renowned German-Swiss painter, would later be commissioned to paint portraits that idealized Henry's regal presence, visually reinforcing the myth of the Renaissance monarch. The king's love of music was not passive. He played multiple instruments, including the lute and organ, and took great delight in performance. This embrace of culture was not merely personal. It was deeply political. Henry understood that magnificence could serve as a form of soft power. Through architecture, literature, and elaborate court entertainments, he projected strength, stability, and superiority. Palaces like Hampton Court were expanded to reflect grandeur and wealth. Lavish tournaments and masks, elaborate dramatic performances with allegorical themes, reinforced the glory of his reign, painting Henry as the ideal Christian prince. The young king's passion for sport and physical prowess also shaped his early rule. He excelled in jousting, hunting, archery, and wrestling, and these displays of athleticism were not only personal indulgences, they were also performative acts of masculinity and vitality. In a society where strength was equated with divine favor, the king's robust physicality became a symbolic asset. He was often portrayed in armor or regal robes, towering and broad-shouldered, embodying the ideals of both chivalric and classical heroism. Despite the outward grandeur, Henry's court was not free from tension. The early balance between humanist thought and medieval tradition was delicate. While he promoted scholarship and debate, Henry was also deeply committed to maintaining royal authority and traditional hierarchy. He admired reformist ideas, but had little tolerance for challenges to his supremacy. Even in these early years, his court was structured around patronage and loyalty, and he remained the unquestioned center of power. One of Henry's lesser-known pursuits was his fascination with theology. Unlike many monarchs who left religious matters to clergy, Henry engaged deeply with doctrinal issues. His early writings include a passionate defense of the Catholic Church against Martin Luther's attacks, culminating in the 1521 publication of Defense of the Seven Sacraments, for which Pope Leo X awarded him the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. This ironic honor would be rescinded years later, but at the time, it confirmed Henry's image as a pious and intellectual monarch. Henry's relationship with the nobility in these early years was carefully managed. While he entertained many of them at court and involved them in pageantry and tournaments, he kept political power centralized. He relied heavily on a few trusted advisors and curbed the influence of feuding noble families, a lingering problem from the Wars of the Roses. His ability to charm and dominate socially helped maintain loyalty, but it also bred an environment where favor was precarious and ambition often dangerous. Education and humanist ideals also extended to the royal family's domestic environment. Henry placed importance on the education of his children and close relatives, including his sisters and eventual heirs. Women of the court were encouraged to read, write, and participate in intellectual life, reflecting a progressive, if still patriarchal, vision of elite society. This atmosphere would have a lasting influence on figures like his daughter Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's most intellectually formidable monarchs. In these early years, Henry VIII crafted a persona that balanced the medieval and the modern, the warrior and the scholar. His reign began not as a revolution, but as a synthesis, merging old values with new aspirations. His belief in divine kingship remained absolute, but his image was enhanced by the trappings of Renaissance excellence. By the mid-1520s, the glittering court of Henry VIII had begun to dim under the weight of a single, looming concern: the failure to produce a male heir. After years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry had only one surviving child, the Princess Mary. Multiple pregnancies had ended in stillbirths or early deaths, each loss deepening Henry's anxiety about the Tudor succession. This obsession with dynastic stability would ultimately catalyze one of the most seismic political and religious shifts in English history. Henry's desire for a male heir was not simply a personal matter. It was a national concern. The Wars of the Roses, still fresh in collective memory, had revealed the perils of an uncertain line of succession. Henry saw the birth of a healthy male child not only as a blessing, but as an insurance policy against civil unrest. His belief in the divine right of kings was tempered by his practical awareness of what could happen if that divine right was left unguarded by blood. It was against this backdrop that Anne Boleyn entered Henry's orbit. She was intelligent, fashionable, and unlike any woman the king had pursued before. Having spent time in the French court and possessed a continental sophistication and wit that set her apart. Unlike her sister Mary, who had previously been Henry's mistress and refused to become a passing affair, she insisted on marriage and a crown if she were to surrender to the king's advances. Anne's resistance only inflamed Henry's desire. She became not just an object of affection, but a symbol of what he could not yet possess. Letters from Henry II and reveal the intensity of his passion, a rare glimpse into the emotional life of a man typically cloaked in regal authority. As the relationship deepened, Anne's influence grew. She was not merely a romantic interest, but an active participant in court politics and religious discourse. This relationship, however, collided headlong with Henry's existing marriage to Catherine. Convinced that his union with Catherine was cursed by God due to her prior marriage to his brother Arthur, Henry sought to annul it. He cited a verse from Leviticus stating that a man who marries his brother's wife will remain childless. Though he had initially defended the validity of the marriage, his interpretation had now reversed, prompted more by personal desire than theological conviction. Henry's request for an annulment was submitted to Pope Clement VII in 1527, launching what would become known as the King's Great Matter. At first, Henry expected a swift resolution, but politics, not piety, determined the outcome. Catherine's nephew was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and one of the most powerful men in Europe. Charles exerted immense influence over the Pope, who found himself diplomatically cornered. Granting the annulment would offend the emperor, denying it would alienate the English king. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief advisor and Lord Chancellor, was tasked with securing the annulment but failed to deliver results. His inability to navigate the complex politics of Rome ultimately led to his downfall. In 1529, he was stripped of his titles and power, dying a broken man the following year. Wolsey's fall marked the beginning of a new phase in Henry's rule, one in which the king began to assert personal control over both the state and the church. In his frustration with Rome, Henry began to lean on new voices, among them Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer. Both men were reform-minded and saw in the annulment crisis an opportunity to restructure the very foundation of English authority. Their counsel gradually shifted Henry's thinking from seeking the Pope's approval to challenging the Pope's jurisdiction altogether. The matter of the annulment had evolved into a matter of sovereignty. By 1533, Henry had grown impatient. With and pregnant, and the legitimacy of her child in question, swift action was imperative. Defying papal authority, he secretly married Anne Boleyn in a private ceremony. Shortly afterward, Archbishop Cranmer, newly appointed and sympathetic to reform, formally annulled the marriage to Catherine and was crowned queen, and a daughter, Elizabeth, was born later that year. The break with Rome was not yet complete, but the path was now irreversible. The king's great matter, at its heart, was a convergence of desire, fear, and ambition. What began as a marital dispute evolved into a constitutional revolution. Henry's pursuit of a legitimate male heir led him to challenge the most powerful institution in Europe, dismantling centuries of religious unity in England. The 1530s marked a profound turning point in English history, as Henry VIII, once a staunch defender of Catholicism, severed ties with the Roman Church. What had started as a personal marital crisis evolved into a sweeping transformation of England's religious and political landscape. No longer content to seek approval from the papacy, Henry now asserted a bold new vision of monarchy, one where the crown reigned supreme over both the state and the soul. The break with Rome was not announced with a single declaration, but unfolded through a series of calculated legislative acts. Chief among these was the Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, which declared the king to be the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. This momentous law redefined religious authority in England, placing it firmly in the hands of the monarch rather than the Pope. It was a political masterstroke cloaked in religious language, a consolidation of power unlike any seen in the realm before. To enforce the new religious order, Henry required loyalty not just in action, but in thought. The oath of supremacy was introduced, requiring subjects to acknowledge the king's authority over the church. Refusal was seen as treason. Among the most famous martyrs of this policy was Sir Thomas More, once a close confidant of the king. More's principled refusal to endorse the break led to his execution in 1535, a chilling signal of the new regime's intolerance for dissent. Despite the dramatic reshaping of England's religious structure, Henry's theological convictions remained surprisingly conservative. He maintained many traditional Catholic doctrines, such as the belief in transubstantiation and the importance of confession, even as he rejected papal authority. In this way, the English Reformation under Henry was a political revolution, not a doctrinal one. The king did not embrace Protestantism, but carved a middle path that placed himself above all spiritual authorities. The transition from Roman Catholicism to royal supremacy was neither smooth nor universally accepted. Clergy, monastic orders, and devout laypeople found themselves caught between obedience to Rome and allegiance to the crown. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, a large-scale rebellion in northern England, epitomized this resistance. Tens of thousands rose in protest, demanding a return to papal authority and the reinstatement of dissolved monasteries. Henry responded with a blend of appeasement and brutal suppression, executing the rebellion's leaders and reinforcing his dominion. To legitimize and enforce this upheaval, Henry relied heavily on Thomas Cromwell, his chief minister and architect of reform. Cromwell oversaw the Vlll Ecclesiasticus, a massive survey of church wealth that laid the groundwork for the dissolution of the monasteries. While the dissolution itself would be tackled in depth in the next chapter, it's important to note here how it symbolized the realignment of power. Through Cromwell's administrative precision and Henry's unyielding will, centuries of ecclesiastical privilege began to crumble. The break with Rome also sparked an information war. Printed materials, including proclamations, pamphlets, and translated Bibles, were used to justify the king's supremacy and disseminate his version of religious truth. The printing press became a powerful tool of state propaganda, spreading the royal narrative far beyond the court. Henry, aware of the medium's potential, authorized a new English translation of the Bible, an act that subtly shifted spiritual interpretation from priests to the people. In reordering the church's hierarchy, Henry established a new model of clerical leadership. Bishops were now appointed by the crown, and the convocation of the Church of England was subordinated to royal will. Traditional church courts were reformed or dissolved, and religious policy was increasingly dictated from Whitehall. The monarch was no longer just God's servant on earth, but had become his chosen interpreter. The personal cost of these reforms was significant. Henry faced condemnation from the Pope, diplomatic strain with Catholic powers in Europe, and internal divisions among his subjects. Yet he remained unmoved, convinced of his moral and divine right. He saw himself as a second King David, a ruler guided directly by God, leading his people through a new covenant. This messianic self-image only strengthened as the years progressed. By the end of the decade, Henry had accomplished what few monarchs dared to attempt. He had overturned centuries of religious tradition and redefined the English monarchy. The break with Rome was not merely a schism. It was a revolution cloaked in royal robes, reshaping the structure of power, the practice of faith, and the very identity of a kingdom. The consequences of this upheaval would reverberate far beyond Henry's lifetime. But in the 1530s, it was still unfolding, chaotic, audacious, and irrevocable. With the king now firmly established as supreme head of the Church of England, the most radical phase of Henry VIII's religious transformation began, the systematic dismantling of monastic life across the realm. The dissolution of the monasteries, carried out between 1536 and 1541, was one of the most momentous episodes in Tudor history, altering not only the spiritual landscape of England, but also its economy, architecture, and social fabric. What was once a network of pious institutions became a source of royal enrichment and a tool for political consolidation. Monasteries had long been pillars of medieval English society. Beyond their spiritual roles, they served as hospitals, schools, inns, and poorhouses. They held vast swaths of land and accumulated significant wealth over the centuries through tithes, donations, and land rents. In many rural areas, monks and nuns were among the only literate people, providing essential services to the local populace. Their libraries, filled with illuminated manuscripts and theological tomes, were some of the richest depositories of knowledge in Europe. For Henry and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, the monasteries represented a dangerous duality. They were bastions of papal loyalty and immense, untapped reservoirs of wealth. In the new order being forged, These institutions were incompatible with the centralized authority of a monarch who had declared spiritual independence from Rome. Thus, their dissolution was framed not only as a political necessity, but as a moral and religious correction, purging corruption and returning the church to purity. The operation began under a veneer of reform. Cromwell commissioned a comprehensive survey known as the Vlll Ecclesiasticus in 1535, assessing the income and assets of every religious house in England and Wales. This audit laid bare the staggering wealth of monastic institutions, offering a compelling justification for their seizure. To prepare public opinion, reports were circulated accusing monks of idleness, sexual misconduct, and superstition, charges that were exaggerated, though not always baseless. Armed with data and pretexts, Cromwell moved swiftly. In 1536, Parliament passed the Act for the Dissolution of the Lesser Monasteries, targeting all houses with incomes under £200 a year. Hundreds of small priories and abbeys were closed, their lands confiscated and valuables sent to the royal treasury. Monks were offered pensions or transferred to larger houses, though many resisted, clinging to their vows and way of life. Resistance, however, often led to brutal suppression. As the process expanded, it lost any pretense of moderation. The dissolution of the greater monasteries, carried out between 1538 and 1540, was more sweeping and violent. Even prominent and well-endowed abbeys like Glastonbury, Fountains, and Westminster were razed or repurposed. Abbots who refused to surrender their houses, like Richard Whiting of Glastonbury, were arrested, tried for treason, and executed. Many monasteries were gutted, their stone used for secular buildings, and their sacred relics destroyed or discarded. The redistribution of monastic wealth served Henry's interests on multiple fronts. Financially, it replenished the royal coffers, which had been drained by court extravagance and military ventures. Politically, it enabled the king to buy loyalty. Nobles, courtiers, and upwardly mobile gentry were granted or sold former church lands at favorable rates, binding their fortunes to the success of the Reformation. In this way, a new elite class emerged, less dependent on inherited titles and more rooted in royal favor. The social consequences, however, were devastating for many. With the closure of monasteries, countless people lost access to alms, medical care, and shelter. Monastic schools and scriptoriums vanished, and the cultural loss was incalculable. Hundreds of years of tradition were swept away in a few short years, replaced not by new institutions, but by private estates and noble manors. Rural communities, especially in the north, were hit hardest, fueling resentment and unrest that would simmer for decades. The architectural remnants of the dissolution are still visible across England. Crumbling abbey ruins stand as silent witnesses to this violent rupture with the past. While some former monasteries were converted into palaces or country houses, many were simply left to decay. Their stones, once carved with sacred precision, were repurposed to build barns, fences, and city walls. The sacred became secular, and the continuity of religious life was replaced with the fragmentation of Reformed worship. By the end of the 1540s, monasticism had been eradicated from English soil. What had begun as a political maneuver to secure royal supremacy evolved into a cultural revolution, one that enriched the crown, empowered new elites, and laid the foundation for a deeply altered national identity. The dissolution was not just an act of destruction. It was a deliberate reshaping of the country's spiritual geography, carried out with ruthless efficiency and crowned with temporal gain. Henry VIII's reign was not only defined by matters of state and religion, but also by the tumultuous and often tragic series of marriages that punctuated his personal life. Each of his 6 wives brought with them unique personalities, ambitions, and consequences, not only for Henry's private life, but for the kingdom itself. These unions, shaped as much by diplomacy and dynastic pressure as by passion, revealed the volatile intersection between the personal desires of the monarch and the ever-shifting currents of Tudor politics. Following the death of Queen Catherine of Aragon and the fall of Vlll, Henry's 3rd wife, Jane Seymour, offered a reprieve from the storm. Demure, obedient, and traditionally feminine in demeanor, Jane was perceived as the perfect consort by the conservative faction at court. In 1537, she achieved what her predecessors had not. She gave birth to a male heir, Edward, the future Edward VI. However, Jane's triumph was short-lived. She died of postnatal complications just days later, leaving Henry devastated. In his later years, he would regard her as his true wife and request to be buried beside her. Jane's death created a diplomatic opportunity. With England now isolated from much of Catholic Europe, Henry's advisors sought to bolster foreign alliances through marriage. Thus entered Anne of Cleves, a German noblewoman and sister to a Protestant duke. Her portrait, painted flatteringly by Hans Holbein, pleased the king, but the reality was less agreeable. Upon meeting her in person in 1540, Henry was famously repulsed, likening her appearance to that of a Flanders mare. Their marriage, never consummated, was annulled after just 6 months, but Anne managed to avoid the fate of her predecessors by accepting the dissolution with grace, earning the king's favor and a generous settlement. While Anne of Cleves faded into a comfortable retirement, Henry quickly became enamored with Catherine Howard, a vivacious teenager and cousin to the ill-fated Anne Boleyn. Her youth and charm reinvigorated the aging king, who was now plagued by ill health and growing corpulence. However, Catherine's past and present indiscretions soon caught up with her. Accused of adultery, an act considered treasonous in a queen, she was arrested, interrogated, and ultimately executed in 1542. Her downfall marked another chapter in the grim pattern of Henry's romantic entanglements. In the wake of Catherine Howard's execution, the court once again sought stability. The final woman to join the ranks of Henry's wives was Catherine Parr, a twice-widowed noblewoman known for her intellect, piety, and diplomacy. Catherine was not merely a consort, but a political partner. She played an active role in the education of Henry's children and engaged in religious discourse, supporting moderate reformist views. Her ability to manage the volatile royal temper and her deft navigation of courtly intrigue allowed her to survive where others had fallen. Beyond their individual fates, Henry's wives collectively influenced the line of succession, the factional balance of power at court, and the religious orientation of the realm. The constant reshuffling of queens created space for different court factions to rise and fall, aligning themselves with each new consort in hopes of influence and favor. These shifts often extended beyond courtly circles, affecting foreign relations and church appointments. Each marriage also left a deep mark on Henry himself. Once a charismatic and energetic king, he became increasingly paranoid, erratic, and physically incapacitated. By the 1540s, he suffered from leg ulcers, obesity, and depression. His emotional volatility grew more pronounced after each personal disappointment, and the psychological toll of his marital failures seemed to mirror the political unrest that rippled through the court. The women of Henry's court were more than victims or ornaments. They were agents of change, symbols of factional hope, and sometimes casualties of a system that afforded them little protection. Their stories unfolded against a backdrop of ambition and survival, where the favor of the king could elevate or destroy in equal measure. Some, like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, paid the ultimate price. Others, like Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr, maneuvered carefully and lived to see beyond Henry's reign. The political stakes of Henry's marriages extended into the very fabric of his dynasty. The legitimacy of his children, particularly Mary and Elizabeth, was often questioned due to the annulments and executions of their mothers. These complications would haunt the kingdom long after Henry's death, setting the stage for a contested and turbulent succession. The court of Henry VIII was more than the royal household. It was the volatile heart of English politics, where fortunes were made and lost in a single glance, and where ambition, betrayal, and manipulation coursed as freely as the wine at royal banquets. Amid the grandeur of Whitehall and Hampton Court, behind the polished manners and silk-clad courtiers, an invisible war of influence simmered, a battle waged not with swords, but with whispers, letters, and calculated gestures. At the center of this web stood Henry VIII himself, whose shifting favor made him both a monarch and a prize to be won. His moods, ailments, and romantic entanglements shaped the rise and fall of powerful men and women. As his authority grew more absolute, so too did the importance of access. To speak in the king's ear, even for a moment, could change policy, alter history, or sign a death warrant. Among the most influential figures in the early part of Henry's reign was Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the son of a butcher who rose to become Lord Chancellor and one of the wealthiest men in England. Brilliant and ambitious, Wolsey controlled nearly all aspects of government and diplomacy for a time, but his inability to secure the annulment of Henry's first marriage ultimately sealed his downfall. Stripped of power and facing charges of treason, he died in disgrace en route to trial in 1530. Wolsey's fall created a vacuum swiftly filled by Thomas Cromwell, whose administrative genius reshaped England during the Reformation. As the architect of the break with Rome and the mastermind behind the dissolution of the monasteries, Cromwell wielded immense power, using Parliament to legitimize radical changes. Yet court politics are never static. His advocacy for Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, which displeased the king, gave his enemies an opening. He was arrested and executed in 1540, the same day Henry wed Catherine Howard. Opposing Cromwell throughout much of his ascendancy was Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, a staunch conservative and head of one of England's most prestigious families. Norfolk navigated courtly waters with the guile of a seasoned noble, positioning his relatives, like in Boleyn and Catherine Howard, into the king's bed and into power. Yet the downfall of both women proved fatal to his ambitions. Though spared execution, Norfolk was imprisoned late in Henry's reign and narrowly escaped death only due to the king's own demise. Other factions vied for dominance in the final decade of Henry's rule. The conservative bloc, which sought to return England to traditional Catholic practices, minus papal authority, clashed with reformists pushing for a more radical Protestant doctrine. Figures like Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, and Thomas Wriothesley, loyal to the old ways, competed with reformers such as Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and Edward Seymour, who envisioned a different religious future. These power struggles were not confined to policy debates. They unfolded in private chambers, in coded letters, and in the favor shown at courtly pageants and dinners. Patronage determined loyalty, and spies were everywhere. Even the women of the court played vital roles, acting as informants, allies, or pawns in the games of their husbands and fathers. In such an environment, failure to read the room could be fatal. One of the most dangerous elements of Henry's court was the Privy Council, a body of select advisors that evolved into a powerful governing institution. As Henry's health declined, the council became the arena where succession plans and post-Henry governance were fiercely debated. counselors maneuvered to secure guardianships over the young Prince Edward and to eliminate rivals who might shape the future king's policies. Personal rivalry often bled into national policy. The arrest of Cranmer in 1543, though he was later saved by the king's intervention, reflected the intensity of the religious and political infighting. Likewise, the execution of Queen Catherine Howard had far-reaching implications, decimating the Howard family's influence and tilting court dynamics toward reformist sympathies. Every fall from grace sent ripples through every chamber of power. As Henry neared the end of his reign, paranoia and control defined his court. Surveillance increased, alliances became more fragile, and the fear of being implicated in treason kept even the most powerful in check. The king's word, delivered through trembling lips or sealed scrolls, had become absolute. And yet, beneath the surface of obedience and protocol, the game of survival continued, deadly, elegant, and unrelenting. As Henry VIII aged into his final decade, the question of succession loomed larger than ever. Though he had achieved a male heir, the stability of the Tudor line was far from guaranteed. The nation stood at the crossroads of tradition and transformation, and with the king's health in steep decline, his final years became consumed by the effort to secure his legacy, not just through blood, but through the law and the architecture of monarchy itself. At the heart of this legacy building was the Third Succession Act of 1543, a legal maneuver that reflected Henry's need to address the precariousness of his dynastic line. It restored both Mary and Elizabeth, his daughters from his first two marriages, to the line of succession, though it did not re-legitimize them, as both had been declared illegitimate after the fall of their mothers. The act was a political compromise, crafted to ensure continuity in the absence of multiple male heirs. It also highlighted Henry's growing willingness to use Parliament to shape royal prerogative, signaling a departure from purely hereditary claims. But securing succession was not merely a matter of naming heirs. Henry sought to institutionalize his wishes through legal and bureaucratic means. His 1544 will, drafted with painstaking detail and enforced by the Succession Council, outlined the order of inheritance and the structure of governance after his death. This document was revolutionary in how it placed power in writing rather than custom, using law to bend tradition to his will. The king's preoccupation with his posthumous influence led to innovations in governance that would echo throughout English constitutional history. Henry's desire for control extended to the Regency Council he established for his son, Edward. Anticipating Edward's minority at the time of his accession, Henry carefully selected a group of men, nobles, clerics, and advisors, whom he trusted to guide the kingdom in his absence. Yet this attempt at collective rule masked the deeper reality of factional competition. The council, once formed, would quickly become a battleground for supremacy, as each member sought to assert dominance and shape the realm in their image. Beyond legal maneuvering, Henry also worked to fortify his dynastic image. Portraiture, pageantry, and public spectacle were used to solidify the notion of Tudor divine right. His likeness was cast in stone, wood, and paint, most famously by Hans Holbein the Younger, as a larger-than-life monarch, broad-shouldered, confident, and eternal. These artistic depictions were not mere vanity, but carefully curated symbols of unassailable kingship, meant to project power to both subjects and foreign powers. Meanwhile, the geopolitical landscape shifted beneath Henry's feet. Though once eager to wage war in France to assert traditional claims and noble masculinity, he began to recognize the strain these campaigns placed on his resources. By the 1540s, peace with both France and the Holy Roman Empire had become more desirable, not out of a change in character, but due to practical necessity. Diplomatic alliances, treaties, and occasional hostilities continued, but Henry increasingly focused on securing internal strength rather than projecting outward ambition. In the north, the Anglo-Scottish frontier remained volatile. The failed attempt to marry Prince Edward to the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, through the Treaty of Greenwich led to the bitter conflict known as the Rough Wooing. This campaign, waged to force Scotland into union with England, underscored the complexities of dynastic politics and the futility of enforcing such unions through military might. The consequences would continue to reverberate for generations, influencing England's fraught relationship with its northern neighbor. Religiously, though Henry had broken from Rome and declared himself head of the Church of England, he remained doctrinally conservative in many respects. In his final years, the Henrician Church settled into a kind of uneasy ambiguity, neither fully Catholic nor entirely Protestant. This ambiguity was deliberate. Henry resisted the radical reforms urged by some of his advisors, preferring a slow, tightly controlled evolution of worship that retained many traditional elements while asserting royal supremacy. It was a balancing act meant to stabilize the nation and guard against foreign condemnation. Administratively, the latter years of Henry's reign saw a significant expansion of the royal bureaucracy. Reforms in finance, governance, and the legal system centralized authority under the crown to a degree unseen in earlier reigns. Institutions such as the Court of Augmentations and the Court of Wards and Liveries were established to manage former monastic lands and feudal incomes. These bodies laid the groundwork for a more modern, efficient state, increasing royal revenues while entrenching the idea of a king not just as a ruler, but as the architect of an administrative machine. As Henry VIII approached death in early 1547, his legacy remained complex and incomplete. He had reshaped the English monarchy, elevated the power of statute and administration, and laid the foundation for religious and political revolutions yet to unfold. In the waning years of Henry VIII's life, the grandeur of his early reign gave way to an increasingly somber and painful existence. The once athletic and charismatic monarch, famed for his jousting prowess and courtly charm, had been replaced by a man broken in body and, some would argue, in spirit. The decline was neither sudden nor silent. It unfolded slowly, marked by a steady erosion of physical vitality and an intensifying withdrawal from those closest to him. By the mid-1540s, Henry's health had deteriorated dramatically. He suffered from chronic leg ulcers, the result of a jousting accident years earlier, which festered and resisted all treatments. The pain was constant and debilitating, often making it difficult for him to walk or even stand unaided. His courtiers were forced to carry him in specially constructed chairs or on padded stretchers. The once vigorous figure who had dominated courtly entertainments was now largely confined to his chambers, irritable and swollen, commanding from a throne of cushions and shadows. Compounding his physical ailments was his severe obesity. By the time of his death, Henry was believed to weigh over 300 pounds, and his immense girth not only aggravated his wounds, but also made everyday activities nearly impossible. Tailors struggled to craft garments large enough to fit his expanding frame, and his armor had to be custom built, its enormous dimensions a testament to his increasing immobility. Despite his condition, Henry continued to indulge in rich foods and elaborate feasts, seemingly undeterred by the worsening of his physical state. The king's isolation deepened as his body failed him. Once surrounded by lively courtiers, musicians, and scholars, Henry became increasingly suspicious and withdrawn. Trusted advisors visited him in brief, highly formalized audiences, and he kept even his closest allies at arm's length. The loss of several wives, the betrayal of trusted confidants, and the constant flux of court factions had fostered a profound sense of paranoia. He feared conspiracy and treachery at every corner, and his temper grew more volatile with each passing year. Henry's mental condition also suffered under the weight of his ailments and memories. Though never officially declared insane, his moods shifted unpredictably from melancholic brooding to violent outbursts. Courtiers treaded carefully in his presence, knowing that even minor offenses could provoke severe consequences. The king's judgment became clouded at times, swayed by whichever advisor had his ear at a given moment. In this environment, flattery became currency and honest counsel a dangerous gamble. Amid his physical and psychological decline, Henry sought refuge in religious rituals and personal reflection. Though he had broken from the authority of the Pope, he remained deeply devoted to his interpretation of Christian faith. He attended Mass regularly, commissioned devotional works, and surrounded himself with religious texts and relics. Some describe this period as one of spiritual introspection, a late attempt to reconcile the magnitude of his decisions with the state of his soul. Despite his infirmities, Henry remained actively involved in governance. From his private apartments, he continued to issue royal commands, review documents, and oversee policy. His scribes, ministers, and messengers moved in a constant stream between his chambers and the machinery of government. Even in illness, the image of kingly authority had to be maintained, and Henry took great care to preserve the appearance of control, even when he lacked the strength to exert it directly. His final public appearances were rare and carefully orchestrated. When he did emerge, it was with great effort, his presence intended more as a symbol than as a functioning ruler. Attendees at court events spoke of the heavy air that accompanied his entrances, the blend of awe and sorrow provoked by the sight of the once glorious monarch now trapped in his own body. Even in such decline, Henry's presence could command silence and reverence. As death approached in early 1547, Henry became preoccupied with the fate of his soul and the future of his kingdom. He summoned clerics, made confessions, and offered final prayers. He also made certain that his wishes regarding succession, burial, and the regency of Prince Edward were clearly recorded. In these final acts, he strove to ensure that the world he had reshaped would endure beyond his breath, even as his body betrayed him. When he finally passed on January 28, 1547, at the age of 55, there was no great fanfare. His death, kept secret for several days, marked the end of an era defined by seismic shifts in power, religion, and monarchy. The death of Henry VIII did not silence his influence. Rather, it marked the beginning of a long and complex reckoning with his legacy. Unlike monarchs whose impacts fade with time, Henry's imprint remained indelible, stamped into the very structure of English society, law, religion, and monarchy. His life had been turbulent, but it was in the aftermath of his death that the full magnitude of his reign was felt across the British Isles and beyond. His only male heir, Edward VI, succeeded him at just 9 years old. But the England he inherited was a fundamentally different realm from the one Henry had been born into. It was no longer a feudal kingdom tethered to the authority of the Pope, but a sovereign nation-state with a centralized monarchy and an increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy. Henry had not merely ruled. He had redefined what it meant to be king. His legacy was therefore not just familial, it was institutional and ideological. One of the most lasting consequences of Henry's reign was the transformation of the English Church. Though the theological direction of Protestantism would intensify under Edward VI and later solidify under Elizabeth I, the initial breach with Rome had been Henry's doing. By asserting royal supremacy over religious matters, he had created a model in which the monarch wielded spiritual as well as temporal power, a shift that would ripple through every parish and pulpit in the land. The Church of England would continue to evolve, but its foundation was laid in Henry's act of political defiance cloaked in divine right. The nobility and aristocracy, too, had been irrevocably reshaped. With the dissolution of the monasteries and the redistribution of church lands, a new class of landowners emerged, wealthy, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to the crown. These gentry families would become the backbone of the Tudor state, deeply invested in the continuation of the monarchy that had enriched them. Henry's reign had loosened the old feudal bonds and replaced them with ties of service and opportunity, bound together by patronage and power. In terms of governance, Henry's reign marked a clear pivot toward a more modern conception of statecraft. He had employed Parliament not as a ceremonial body, but as a legislative instrument, using it to pass sweeping religious and political reforms. This strategic use of law to consolidate authority established a precedent for future rulers and embedded the idea that even royal power could be expressed and constrained through legal mechanisms. The monarchy remained absolute in theory, but increasingly, it operated within a legalistic framework that would one day evolve into constitutional monarchy. Culturally, Henry had presided over and contributed to the English Renaissance. He had been a patron of the arts, letters, and architecture, encouraging the growth of humanist thought and commissioning works that reflected both piety and power. The royal court became a center of intellectual exchange, attracting scholars, artists, and musicians from across Europe. Though his later years were marred by suspicion and isolation, his earlier patronage helped spark a flourishing of English culture that would reach its zenith in the Elizabethan era. The legacy of Henry VIII was not without darker shadows. His reign had normalized political executions as tools of governance, and his mercurial temper had cost the lives of both enemies and once trusted allies. The legal innovations he pioneered included the ruthless use of treason laws and attainders to eliminate dissent. These tactics fostered a climate of fear that would persist for decades, instilling a caution in the English political class that often stifled open dissent. His authoritarian streak left a cautionary example of how power, when unchecked, could devour those closest to it. Henry's 6 marriages, though often sensationalized, also played a critical role in shaping future expectations of royal conduct and succession. No English king before him had so publicly and repeatedly dissolved unions, and each queen brought with her new alliances political shifts and controversies. The notion that royal marriages were strategic tools, subject to annulment, manipulation, and even execution, altered how future monarchs approached both matrimony and the dynastic imperative. Beyond England, the European powers watched Henry's legacy unfold with keen interest. The Reformation, which he had joined for personal reasons, gained international momentum, splintering Christendom and redrawing the religious map of Europe. England, once peripheral in continental affairs, had now positioned itself as both challenger and innovator, no longer merely a realm on the edge of Catholic Europe, but a force with its own identity and trajectory. Ultimately, Henry VIII left behind a kingdom in transition. His reign had been a bridge between medieval traditions and early modern realities. He had been a man of contradictions, a humanist who executed scholars, a devout Christian who defied the Pope, a defender of the faith who dismantled the Church's foundations. Yet in all these contradictions lay the strength of his legacy. He embodied the turbulence of an age in transformation, and in so doing, ensured that his name would never be forgotten, not merely as a king, but as a shaper of nations and a symbol of power's complexity.